All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest to the show. It is Nico from the Fossil team and the NABC. Welcome to the show, Nico.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I heard you for the first time on with Doug Highcheck and Alex over on Untold Radio, and I actually reached out to Alex to hook us up because I wanted to get you on the show so my audience could hear what you had to say. So I really do appreciate you taking time to be with us today.
No problem. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's get right into it. Let's talk about a little bit about your background, who you are. You're a paleontologist by trade. So I want to talk a little bit about what got you interested in that subject. Tell us a little bit about your education and what sent you down the path that you've been on for a while now.
Yeah. Well, when I was a kid, my dad had this little small collection of fossils, and he's really into anthropology and the past and all that and history. And he started showing me these fossils, and two of the fossils he had a T-Rex tooth and a half of a mammoth tooth, a woolly mammoth. And I held those in my hand when I was a kid, and I just thought they were the coolest things, and I have been hooked on them ever since. Um, Watched all the movies, watched all the documentaries, made friends, and in the paleo field, and here I am. But I never had the fortunate ability, I guess, to go to a full college, and so I never really got to go follow up on my paleontology career that I wanted. And I mean, I did all the stuff, I read all the papers and I read all the books. I do everything I can, and I'm friends with other paleontologists. I just don't have the piece of paper that I can flap in the air, you know? And so going to a museum, there's avenues that people could take, but out here where I'm at, there's no dinosaur museums. The closest one is actually in Seattle. It's the Burke Museum, and I'm out here in Portland in near Rhododendron, or I'm in Rhododendron near Portland, other way around. And so I decided to start the fossil team, which is my business, where I teach paleontology and basically had to make my own career. So so that's kind of where my paleontology came in, and it's still very rampant today. It's literally covering my arms and everywhere else. So yeah.
Among other things, I definitely want to get into the cool tattoos, but I just had Pat Spain on the show. Well, he hadn't been on the show yet. I talked to Pat a week or so back, and for those that aren't familiar with Pat, he's done a couple of shows, The Beast Hunter and The Legend Hunter, I think, on a couple of different networks. And he's a marine biologist, and he's very much into nature and animals in general. And that's one of the things I asked Pat was about his parents and his growing up and how they influenced that. And he's actually the great grandnephew, I think, as he put it, of Charles Fort, who, basically is the father of 40N research. And that's one of the things that always fascinates me. Like, I do a podcast, I do 6 shows, but the main show that I do is on Sasquatch. And I had nothing in my growing up days, in my childhood days, that came from my parents or even my close family that influenced that for me. At least I don't think so. Some of the stories I grew up with in North Georgia about ginseng hunters encountering woolly, hairy men in the woods and those kind of things sort of influenced me and my own experiences when I was 12. So you mentioned your dad. Were your parents into that kind of stuff outside of just the couple of things your dad was into? Were they very supportive of your choices to go in and follow this as a career?
Uh, well, yes. My parents, at least in the paleontology side, my parents were very supportive of me doing this. They wanted me to do sports and stuff, and the rest of my family, my siblings, all 5 younger siblings, all have done sports, and I tried, but I was just so focused on this that they just kind of gave up after a while. They're like, all right, fine, let's do the dinosaur thing. But when I started doing the Sasquatch stuff, um, my mom was a little supportive. She was like, "Yeah, that's okay, sure, like whatever makes you happy, man." And my dad was like, "What are you doing?" And he's still kind of like that, but he sees how it's helping right now too. So he's starting to be a little bit more open to it. the rest of my family, my mom included, especially after I've started working in this stuff, have found that they are way more into it than I am, actually. like don't get me wrong, I like Bigfoot and I like researching it and stuff, but it's another animal to me, and you know, I love all animals the same way. So I'm not like jumping out of my boots and making Bigfoot everything, you know. Um, but my siblings are starting to get really into it, and I'll come back to that when we start talking about Cliff. But um, yeah, my dad is been the tough cookie to crack in this case.
It seems the same for everybody. I had that conversation with Cliff, and Cliff was gracious enough to his parents have both passed away, and that was one of the questions I asked Cliff was how they felt about him on finding Bigfoot and just the Bigfoot thing in general. And it was a progression of things that went through, and I'm always curious about that because I have friends and family who think I'm crazy because I do a Bigfoot podcast and I believe the stories and all the things that happen. But you mentioned Cliff, so let's talk a little bit about that. How did you become involved in the North American Bigfoot Center, the NABC out in Boring, Oregon? How did that come about? Was that something that you sought out, or was it just a chance meeting that put you on the team there?
It was a little bit of both. A little bit of both. I the NABC opened up around the time I actually moved up to where I live right now, and I was driving back one day. I was driving home, and I know, obviously I know how to get home, but I was using maps and stuff to see the quickest route and all that to avoid the traffic. And I saw on the map a little blip for the North American Bigfoot Center, and I was like, we have a museum about Bigfoot. Let's go check that out. And I went in, and Cliff and Melissa were there. Melissa is his amazing wife. Um, and met them, and started talking to them, and I told them, like, hey, I'm the paleontologist. I study bones and stuff, and also I'm a tracker. So if you ever get anything that you need any help IDing, like, just let me know. Here's my card, and eventually they took me up on that offer when one of our museum members came in with what ended up being a calcium nodule. So I was wrong in my identification originally, but looking at it, it did look like a tooth. So I could see why they thought it was. And I mean, I thought it was a bear tooth. I didn't think it was a Sasquatch tooth. I compared it to the bear, and I could also tell that something was off about it. But to me, it was like, it maybe experienced a little bit of erosion, which is why it's not totally there. But it did look like a flat bear molar. And I've helped them ID a couple of tracks, and ended up having an encounter a little bit after I met them. Actually, my first encounter during one of my tracking classes, and we ended up striking up a friendship when I took them out there, and the rest is history. Now they can't get rid of me.
I'm sure they would not want to do that. So you mentioned it. Let's get right into it. This is an encounters-based show. So you've had several experiences out in, I believe, the Willows area and maybe some other areas in that vicinity. Can you talk about where you were, what you were doing, and tell us what happened during your encounters?
Yeah, well, for the museum, we have a couple of research areas, and we give them all code names so we can talk about them without revealing the actual locations. And the three main places we go are the Willows, is one of them, and the Willows is a place that I have been going for a very, very long time, before I was even before I knew Sasquatch was real. Like, I had been teaching there for 8 years prior, and just I still go there. It's a second home to me. So there's the Willows, there's the Blueberry Bog, which is we have the least amount of access to because it's the one that gets closed off the soonest. And then there's Easter Island, and the Willows is where the first encounter was, obviously. And basically, there's a lot that has happened there. But this first encounter, I was teaching with my class, and it was me and another guy, and we had 8 or 9 kids with us, and we were looking for a new place to put trail cameras because our goal, this was like a year-long class, and our goal was to kind of monitor the animals in the area. And where we had our trail cameras originally, other groups had figured out and had started going into these areas to do tracking. Um, And so we were like, okay, let's just go find a new spot. And let's go to the other side of the willows where people don't normally go. Uh, give us the best opportunity to see animals. And as we went over there, we ended up running into two of them. And I know I'll explain why we know it was two of them. But as we were walking along the trail, one of them growled at me, and the growl didn't match up with any of the animal sounds that I knew. And this is also prior. I did intern at the zoo, and in my studying, I've literally all I do is talk about animals and dinosaurs. So like I know this. I like to think I know this stuff, at least. So it didn't match up, and so I'm trying to figure out what it was. And my teaching partner, he heard something in the woods on the other side of the trail. And as we started focusing on that, I heard it growl again, and that it sounded very, very ape-like. And that was when it, wires connected there, and I was like, oh, that this is something. And my partner, when we ended up putting up the camera, when I was tying it to the tree, my partner ended up possibly seeing one run across the trail behind me, so I missed it. And since then, since we've gone out, we've heard them. We might have seen two of them one night. What else? We haven't found any tracks out there yet. There's a lot of animal wildlife out there, and no Sasquatch tracks. In fact, I rarely find bear tracks, and I know there's a bear that lives in the willows. So it's mainly just like these elk that live there, just tear up the ground and ruin everything before you find it. So, yeah, there's been a lot of stuff there. I have tracked one at the blueberry bog. And that one was probably my favorite one because it was showing behavior, where it was actually chasing some elk. The elk had run straight across the bog itself, leaving this trackway. And then the Sasquatch had actually come at a curve. And here, I'm putting it down here out of the camera. So straight across, and the Sasquatch had curved up, and you can see him getting closer to the elk. Kind of bursting out of the trees. I like to think of like the Jurassic Park 3 scene with the Spinosaurus bursting out, chasing the people at the beginning. And that one was probably my favorite. The cast we got from the one track that was exposed after the water level had receded, the cast is really bad, but really good at the same time, because you can see all the morphology, even though you don't really see the clear shape. It's one of my favorite things to point out to people when they come to the museum and ask, like, hey, can we see that track? I'm like, yeah, of course. So but then the other trackways that I've found, we've found maybe 6 in the last year at Easter Island. And during one of those, there was a track that was deep enough and clear enough that we were able to cast it. And this area is super rocky, so again, the cast isn't that great, but in this one, you can still see the shape of the foot, you can see the toes, and it's probably the best one I've gotten. And hopefully, I hope not, but probably the best one I'll ever get out here. Unless a really clear one does show up at the bog again. And that one is also on display at the museum. And then Easter Island is eventually where I ended up seeing one. So that was actually this last August, which was really cool. Saw it peeking out from behind a tree, just looking at me. And it had snuck up behind us. There were 3 in the area, and we knew this because they were following us for a while. And again, listening to those animal movements, listening to the sounds, they had triangulated themselves around us. And they would stop when we would stop, and they'd go when we would go, and they kept their distance, but also made sure at least one of them had their eyes on us at all times. And when we were out of sight, they kind of panicked and they started moving around a little quicker. You could hear the heavy footfalls, heavy footsteps, very clearly bipedal steps, but still we weren't seeing them at the time we were hearing them, and so we didn't want to like jump to any conclusions, of course. But yeah, it didn't sound like bears, it didn't sound like cats, elk, deer, didn't sound like any of the animals I know out in that area. And then, yeah, eventually I ended up seeing one. And the next day we went back and tracked it, and where it ran away from after I saw it. So that was really cool to have confirmation. Like, oh yeah, I did really see one. There's its footprints, you know?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I love about the foot. That's one thing Cliff and I talked about was he doesn't even really go out. He said he'd love, obviously, he's seen them through therm. He wants to see them without a thermal in the daytime, maybe even get daytime footage, but that's really not what he is all about at this point. It's literally about tracks and being able to cast footprints and look at the morphology and all the things that go into that and the science behind the feet, basically, to study. So let's not breeze over your sighting. What is it that you saw? How did you come to see it? And what can you talk about it in detail as far as what you got to see, facial features or anything that you can recall?
Yeah. So unfortunately I didn't see any features. It was getting dusky, and under the tree canopy where it was, it was very silhouetted. Though I do think if I had a camera, if we had one of our really good cameras that we usually bring, if we didn't this day because we were being idiots that day, just wanted to go hike. But if I had had that good camera, I probably would have been able to zoom in and get a very, very clear shot of the animal, which gonna regret that for the rest of my life. But I was able to make out hair. I was able to make out when I pointed at it, I saw the hair raise. It's a phenomenon that we get called piloerection. Basically, when you're creeped out and the hair on the back of your neck stands up. That's what happened to this thing, because it pointed at me, or I pointed at it, and it was like, "Oh, I've been spotted," um, but yeah, it was big. It was really big. We were estimating about 7.5 feet tall, but about the size of our Sasquatch at the museum. Actually, our replica there, Murphy, shape and everything too. So like that, like Murphy's awesome in terms of how we can use him as a tool when people come in and tell us about their sightings, comparison and whatnot. But yeah, leading up, there's a video, the one video from that day actually, leading up to the sighting. We were walking away from that part where we sat down and got out of view from these things, and they started panicking. I had found scat, and I get excited about any sort of animal sign in the woods. And so I, drop to my knees and I'm like, let's look at this. I'm going to pull it apart real quick. And Connor pulls out his phone and he's filming it. And I'm talking about, the how white it was. And that's probably means it was a predator prey or predator scat, and looking at the shape of it and all this, and it's probably cougar scat. And I'm digging through it, looking for the bones. And we hear this big snap behind us, directly from where we came. And in the video, Keith and me, Keith was the other guy that was there with me. We both turn and look at it at the same time. And in a really creepy way, you can hear Connor in the video go, "That's exactly from where we came from." And but when we got up, the folks at the NAWAC, North American Wood Ape Conservancy, they do this thing where they kind of shuffle each other around when they know there's one in the area, and one of them sits down and the rest of them will leave. And Connor wanted to try that out because they had triangulated themselves around us again, and that's when I saw one, because the one went behind me. I was sitting up against a tree facing Connor and Keith. And it's interesting now that I think about it, that because Connor would have been facing me, one of them should have been facing me, and they didn't see it walk up, which is interesting. So I wonder, because we couldn't find any tracks, like good, clear tracks of it moving up to the area. So I wonder if it was down. I gotta go back and do some tests now. But anyway, yeah, it was right. It would have been right behind me. And when we kind of grouped back together to make this plan, that's when I turned and looked up, because I was getting that creep factor from behind. I like to call it predator sense. It's we get it a lot from. It's an instinct that we have from when we were still being eaten by lions all the time. So that's when I looked up and saw it, and I saw the silhouette, thought it was a stump, pointed at it. That's when the hair raised, and we came up with, or Connor came up with this plan. and we went through with it, and that's when we were going to really test if it was an animal too, because like we still thought it was a stump because it was absolutely still. And so we started walking away, and I looked back up, and sure enough, the thing was gone. And after a few curse words, I got the point across to Keith, who was walking back up towards the car with me. So
Let's
yeah.
talk let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned trail cams earlier, and I know you guys have had some trail cams out. We have trail cams on the property here, and it's one of the things that comes up all the time in relation to Sasquatch is, why aren't we catching these things on trail cams? And I'll be honest, I've seen some trail cam footage and photographs that I believe are legitimate, but will probably never see the light of day because people don't want them shown. What kind of experience have you had just in general with animals in that area? Are you seeing animals? Because honestly, the only thing we found here on the property ever is raccoons, and we don't catch them every single time. So what are you doing? What are you seeing as far as trail cam footage and animals in general?
Yeah. Well, let's back up to what you were saying there about seeing the footage. There is footage out there. I've seen it as well. Um, and it goes back to the stigma behind this, people not wanting to share their photos. We've got some really, really good trail camera photos that clearly show the animals, but we can't do anything with it because the people that own those photos don't want it out. And so, unfortunately, that like people don't want to stick their neck out, and I get that. Um, I didn't want to do it for a while either. But in terms of animals I've caught, I haven't caught any Sasquatches on my cameras, even though we know they're out there. We're trying, but a really good, like, a lot of people come up with this idea that, like, oh, they're sensing the electronics in the cameras or whatnot, or they're seeing the IR light, and then they might see the IR light, but I don't think they're sensing them. They're just very aware of their environment, like most animals are. And coyotes actually avoid trail cameras too. I've actually saw this really great video very recently. I'm on Facebook. I'm part of this trail camera group or whatever. And I saw a video recently. It was the coyote was looking off over to the left or something. It was walking up the trail, and it turns and it sees the camera, and it jumps and goes out of the view. So like, Sasquatch are probably seeing these things and being like, that's a person thing. They probably don't know what it does. They probably don't know it takes pictures, but they know it's a person thing, and they should probably avoid it because they've seen what people things do to other animals. But yeah, I've caught pretty much everything else in the woods. I've caught the cougar. I've caught one cougar photo, and it's super blurry. I cannot stress how many deer and elk photos I have. It is a bit annoying. I will get 200 photos over a month, and 199 of them are the herd of elk. I've got my bear, I've got raccoon, I've got the whole 9 yards out there. And so I think it's only a matter of time until, especially out of the willows, it's only a matter of time until we get one of these things on camera. I actually have to. My plan this month was to go back and move the cameras to a new spot because they've been in the same spot for about 6 months now.
I want to go back to your tracking as well, because I think that's a really underrated part of, at least my opinion, Bigfoot research is tracking. Because again, that's one of the things Cliff and I talked about when I had Cliff on the show a couple of weeks back, was how subtle the sign is for these things. You think it's a 10-foot tall, 800-pound, and everybody's fooled by some of the photos that we see of these 2 or 3 inch impressions in the perfectly where you see the toes. And it's just, that's not reality in at least my experience when I've talked to people about this. So let's talk a little bit about the tracking. What got you interested in tracking? Obviously, it didn't start out tracking Bigfoot, but it's something that you can now use in that research. Talk a little bit about the class, what you cover, and maybe give us sort of a dime store tour for us novice researchers out there, because I try to do this on my property as well, and tons of people listening would certainly benefit from your experience. What are some of the things that you can look for when you go out in general when you're talking about animals, but maybe even more specifically with Bigfoot?
Sure. Well, my interest in tracking kind of stems back to my interest in paleontology and animals. Like, I've always loved wildlife. And so being able to do something that it actively interacts with them without really, interacting with them is something that I find really cool. And tracking tells a story. And as humans, we love stories. So if you get good enough at it, you can tell, like, oh, this was the female bear that lives at the willows. It loves the wild cherry that's out there, and here I can tell that because there's a big pile of bear crap full of cherry pits. Uh, you know, it's the story that really hooks me in tracking and figuring out what the animals are doing, figuring out what they're eating. Just, are they playing? Are they interacting with each other? Are they getting hunted? Are they hunting? Like, I love all that stuff. And the fact that each animal has something different about their track, some minor thing that changes it from a dog track to a cat track, or a cat track to a bear track. But they all have their differences that tell them apart. I love that stuff. It's like matching. It's a big matching game for me. And so my advice for people that are trying to track Sasquatch, especially because Sasquatch feet are very soft, very spongy, and they spread out over a large distance, they're very hard. It's very hard for them to leave a track, especially out here in the Pacific Northwest. We have a lot of pine needle duff. We have a lot of rocky, gravelly areas. We don't have a whole lot of spaces with just mud. And so these soft-footed animals, and this doesn't just go for Bigfoot, it goes for all soft-footed animals, bears, cougars, bobcats, all dogs. Their tracks don't get left behind very often. And so being able to ID the other things, not just the footprints, like what the animal sign, the feed behavior on elk, the feed behavior of cougar, what scat looks like, and identifying, like, yes, it's gross, but you'll start to love it, being like, oh yeah, that turd right there is a coyote turd, and being excited about it, pulling apart with a couple of sticks to see what it was eating. It's all the other stuff. Tracking isn't just footprints. It's all of the behavior that the animal is leaving behind as it moves through its environment. And so with Bigfoot, because one, they're super rare, and two, because of the soft-footed thing I was just talking about, you need to get good at tracking the other animals first. You need to be able to identify the other things, because if you start with Sasquatch, you're going to think everything you find is Sasquatch. One of my, I say favorite because I love seeing all the other tracks, but I'm sure it makes a lot of people unhappy. But one of my favorite things to do at the museum when we get tracks is tell them why it's not a Sasquatch track that they found. I had a guy in the other day that found these bear tracks, and he was arguing that it was on the side of a road, so you can't see the heel. And it's like, well, sure, but here's all the other reasons why I know it's a bear track. And he didn't like that, but I was excited. It was a great bear track. Big black bear track too. And so yeah, getting familiar with all of that. Buy all the tracking books. My favorite one out here, I don't have it with me because it's in my backpack out in my car right now. But Wildlife of the Pacific Northwest is, I think, what it's called. I've got a bunch of them, actually, a bunch of tracking books. But yeah, does that answer the question? I feel like I went all over the place there.
No, it was perfect, actually. And I want to stick sort of with the tracks because there's a couple of things out there in the zeitgeist. Obviously, the Patterson Gimlin film. It's not just the film there that was found that day. There were tracks.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that convinced most of the academics, at least, and the other scientific people that were involved in that situation, that was, in fact, a real Sasquatch walking across the sandbar. And I think it was you I heard maybe talking on with Doug and Alex, something about Patty's tracks and what would be, I think it was the Jerry Crew tracks, Bigfoot or something that was seen together. Was that you that I heard talk about that?
Yeah, and maybe, probably, because I've heard Cliff talk about it, and that's where I got it from. It was tying together with the fact that we might know how their territories work. Something similar to cougars here, if for a North American comparison here, cougars, or orangutans for another ape comparison. trackways, because we can start to identify individuals from their tracks. It's something that we've been working on, which is why Cliff is super into it. Well, one of the many reasons Cliff's super into the feet. Uh, but you can start to identify individuals, and yeah, the individual that we've nicknamed Patty from the Patterson Gimlin film, the female, and the one that gave us the name Bigfoot, the Jerry Crew example, that animal, that one was a big male, and their trackways have been seen walking together. But we have seen the trackways of Bigfoot and another female in a different area, miles and miles away. And we see similar things happening in other areas. So, how their territories work and how orangutan and cougar territories work, you'll have like a female cougar that occupies this space here, and then another female really close by that occupies this space and defends their territory, and maybe here and here, and then you'll have a male that encompasses all of those and kind of rotates through making booty calls, you know. um, and then occasionally you'll get the wandering male that's looking for a territory, and that's when the fights happen, and or a wandering female looking for her territory to establish hers in a new breeding ground. And that's kind of how all the Sasquatches work, and it works a little better for Sasquatches and orangutans because they're not as numerous. Apes tend to not, other than us, of course, apes tend to be very, very low population. They don't have massive numbers. Just look at the gorilla populations. They're very, very low, and they were very low to begin with when they were discovered, because they don't need to be populating every corner of the planet, Whereas cougars, they give birth to more than one baby at a time. They'll have litters, and those litters, if they manage to get all of the cubs to survive to adulthood, all of those have to go out and find new hunting grounds and new territories and stuff. And so that's where you end up getting all of this conflict with ranchers and farmers and stuff with the cougars, but you don't really with Sasquatches, because they have their territories. And yeah, you'll get the few wandering males and females and stuff, but it's not as numerous.
I want to talk a little bit about the question that always comes up, or not always, but typically comes up when you have conversations with people about Bigfoot, skeptical people. And I'm one of those people. I've always been very open about my skepticism about this because I've not seen one of these things. So it comes down to why we don't find bones, why we haven't found a body yet. I know there's stories out there. I have heard stories, and I've covered stories on the show about these things potentially being shot and killed and bodies being moved around. I know there was some guy, I think it was on Coast to Coast back in many decades ago, that claimed to have shot one with a pair of hunting buddies in Alabama, I believe it was. And there's all kinds of stories out there. But as far as I know, as we sit here today, there hasn't been a type specimen brought in on the top of a pickup truck. So let's talk a little bit about, from your experience in paleontology, why we don't find carcasses, why we haven't found one yet that has died naturally, or maybe even some that got wounded or killed by a hunter, whatever the case may be. And let's go a little bit farther beyond that in any order you want to take it. Where are they on the fossil record, and why we don't have enough fossils to say definitively we think this may be what Sasquatch is? So whichever way you want to go with that, whatever you want to tackle first.
Okay. Big topic, but I love this one. So let's first talk about why we don't find the animals themselves, their bones, their bodies, and stuff like that. And I'm the same way with you there, that I've also heard stories of them being shot or finding dead bodies. There was a dude that came in about 2 months ago, I think, that he came in and claimed that he found a dead and decomposing one. And he said the smell was so bad that he had to leave. And he didn't, he went back later, and of course it was gone. But yeah, it's really hard with stories, because that's all they are. They're stories, and especially nowadays with the dead ones, if people are finding dead ones, most people have a camera phone in their pocket. So yes, it's dead and you want to get out of there because it stinks maybe, but take a picture, suck it up for a little bit. You'll be fine. So like I'm also I mean with all of this stuff, I'm super skeptical about most everything that comes my way. I don't try to believe anything unless I have a reason to, like they point out a detail that really only most scientists know about, stuff like that. Um so when it comes to finding the bodies as stories, it's like, yeah, okay, cool. Where's your proof? But um, I do know that finding a dead animal is very, very hard, at least a dead predator. And Sasquatches are predators. They eat other animals. They've uh, been seen taking down deer and elk. They leave specific kill sign for those ones that we do find, which there's another tracking aspect for you. Behavior. Uh, in the environments that Sasquatches tend to inhabit, these deep forested areas, the environment is built for recycling nutrients. And so once that animal dies, it starts to break down very, very quickly. And on top of that, you'd think, oh yeah, the bones, well, those will last a little longer. And yeah, they do last a little longer, but there's a lot of animals out there that eat bone. Rodents are a really, really good one to talk about because one, they gnaw on bones to help with their teeth growth, but they also need the calcium. Same with deer and elk; they eat bone to also get the calcium that's not in their regular plant diet. Um, so nutrient supplement is what it's called. Um, and so, yeah, bodies break down very fast. But with a predator, like deer and elk, they're killed usually. They're killed by a predator, and the predator may drag them off somewhere, but usually they'll leave them somewhere they can find them again if they want to come back. So that's why we find deer and elk bones all the time. That's why we find rabbit bones and stuff. But bears and cougars and Sasquatches, they're these big animals that aren't normally killed by other animals. And when they're dying, they don't know they're dying. They're not like, oh, well, my time has come. They just kind of feel bad. And when an animal feels sick, our dogs and cats do this too, actually. When an animal feels sick, it hides so that it can, recuperate and get better and get back out there. But when they hide and they die, obviously they're already hidden, and the things that are going to find them first are the little things, the critters. And so I think I do actually have, it's right here. I'll grab it for you real quick because I just finished putting it back together. I do have a bear skull here, a black bear, that was delivered to me, and somebody found it in the woods. But it was super super torn apart. Like you can see right there, the jaw. I had to fix the jaw, put it back together. So it does happen. And so there is, like, going back to those stories, there might be some merit to them finding one. Maybe one was shot. I don't know how that bear died. Maybe it was shot and it got away and the hunter couldn't find it. So it goes both ways, but generally that's why predator bones are never found. I think I know of one cougar skull in all the tracking people I know, one cougar skull that somebody found, and it was already kind of buried and falling apart. Like the only reason they could tell it was a cougar skull because it still had some giant canines showing. Most of the cranium was gone. So there's that. Now, when we come to fossilization, that is even rarer. We have all these big dinosaur bones and all these other animal bones, fossils from the prehistoric past, but those are all very, very rare examples that happen in very special circumstances. And especially with bigger animals, the bigger you get, the harder it's going to be to fossilize the entire animal. All of these long, big sauropods we have, the long neck dinosaurs, we just have bits and pieces of most of these things. We don't have a complete skeleton of any of these things, especially the titanosaurs, the really, really big ones. We have like a femur or like a couple of vertebrae in the hip, like stuff like that. And we have to put it together with bits from other sauropods that we know to kind of get a shape, and luckily dinosaurs, there's so many different species that a lot of them do look pretty similar. It's minute differences that make them different species. And even those are up for debate. We don't know, So fossilization happens in substrates that allow for it, and certain circumstances, there we go, that allow for that fossilization process to happen. Sue, the Tyrannosaurus that's at the Field Museum, the most famous one because she's the most complete T-Rex ever found. Sue's a big animal. Sue was a very big dinosaur, and the fact that most of her got buried means that she probably died in a riverbed. She got buried by the sediment very, very quickly, which is why we were able to get the entire skeleton. Most other dinosaurs, like I said, you don't find the whole skeleton. You find bits and pieces. And those are even torn apart too. You got to puzzle piece them back together and kind of figure it out. Lost my train of thought. Hold on. So yeah, very special circumstances. And with these Sasquatches and bears and stuff, the environments that they live in don't really allow for fossilization to happen. The soil is very acidic and it breaks down the bones very quickly. So say a Sasquatch does die and it gets buried by a mudslide. Sure, it's buried. That doesn't mean it's going to fossilize. That's why pieces of Gigantopithecus, the famous one that everybody likes to talk about, that's why we only have jaws and teeth. It also lived in very acidic environments, and apes just tend to live in these jungle environments. Our ancestors, why we're finding more of these Australopithecines and Homo species, is because they were branching out into these other areas that did allow for fossilization to happen. So that's part of the reason we're not finding the bones. We don't have, well, okay, let me rephrase that before I say it. As of right now, there is no fossil evidence of Sasquatch. But if we do manage to get a type specimen, if one is shot and brought into science, if one is hit by a semi-truck, and brought in and people can get that type specimen, we start to figure out where their ancestry lies. We have theories, but where their ancestry lies, and if that's the case, then boom, we have fossil evidence of Sasquatch. I think we already have. And when we look at museum collections, there's full PhD students that make their entire dissertations without even going into the field digging up fossils. It's just from stuff that's already been collected and hasn't been ID'd yet, that are just sitting in their warehouses. So we might have already found a fossilized Sasquatch, and we just haven't looked at it yet. So there you go.
Very true. And that's one of the things that comes up often. There's a lot of people out there who have conspiracy theories and think the government is involved in the cover up, this massive cover up of Bigfoot. I'm not on that train. I've never been able to get on that train. Are there localized things that happen, in parks and stuff that maybe I've heard of, park rangers covering up footprints that were kind of weird. So nobody would think, oh, there's a Sasquatch, because they want people to go out in the woods and enjoy. But in general, I don't necessarily think there's a Sasquatch in the bottom of the Smithsonian somewhere on ice. But you mentioned it a couple of times. Let's talk about Gigantopithecus. Let's talk about the Australopithecus. Let's get into theory a little bit and speculation. And just in your opinion, Nico, if these things exist, and you've seen one, so you're pretty convinced that they do, let's talk about what they could be, because that's not really something I talk about on the show a lot, because I don't really honestly think we're there, because they've not been recognized. We can't 100% across the board say it's a recognized species. So speculating on what they are, it's just freaking fun to me. So when I have somebody like you in your background and I can talk about that, I think it's a really cool place to go. So what do you think? Do you think it's Gigantopithecus? Do you think it's more Australopithecine? What is your thoughts on what these things could be and how they got here?
Right. Well, one of the things I'm working on for the museum, and I hope to make it a display someday, is a possible ancestors setup. And so one of the things I've been researching is all of these different hominids and hominoids and stuff, and apes, fossilized apes, and like I said previously, that apes, it's very hard to get fossilized apes. We don't have a whole lot, and a lot of the ones we do, like Gigantopithecus, it's just partial pieces, so we don't know how they actually looked. But looking at other apes today and their potential fossil lineages, some of them don't have them. Like, we don't have fossilized gorillas. I think it's gorillas, and we have a very few chimps. But it is very hard to come up with a theory. So looking at what we know, let's look at the types of apes we have today. We have gibbons, we have orangutans, we have gorillas, we have chimps, and we have us. And there's some missing parts as well, like the Australopithecines. There's no Australopithecines alive today. Well, hold on. There might be some if we consider the Sasquatch, but as of right now, there is no Australopithecines alive today that are recognized by science. So looking at their ancestry and looking at other fossil apes, Gigantopithecus, for example, we need to figure out where they fit in the line. And looking at the little bit of DNA evidence we can get from these fossils, we cannot get a whole lot of DNA. But the little we can, with Gigantopithecus, it appears that Gigantopithecus is more along the orangutan line, which is actually very far away from it's not like they're still apes. They're still part of the great ape family. The only ape there that isn't is the gibbon. The gibbon is a lesser ape. It's not a great ape. They're closer to that gibbon line. The whole, I think it's Pongo is their scientific name. So Gigantopithecus is somewhere in that orangutan line. I looked at looking at the behaviors that Sasquatches do. I looked at the possibility of a gibbon ancestry, because one of the tests that we did at the museum, we took gibbon calls and we lowered the pitch down, and they sounded just like Sasquatch calls. And looking at their behavior, one of the things a lot of witnesses have told us is that they've seen them almost looking like they're like swimming through the trees, right? That's called brachiation. They're grabbing and pulling themselves forward, which is making them move faster. That's a gibbon thing to do. I mean, most monkeys and apes do it, but it's like gibbons are famous for it. Brachiation. So maybe it's a gibbon, a gibbon that got pushed out of its rainforest environments and had to adapt to a bipedal lifestyle in a savanna. Probably not, but that's a theory, Looking at the timeline, going back in time and looking at how quickly species appear in the fossil record, and looking at how a Sasquatch or any other animal looks today, that gives us a closer line to probably the more truthful idea. And Cliff is along these lines as well, of them being Australopithecines, the upright walking apes. If you look at our favorite example is Paranthropus. It's one of the I was going to say bipedal. They're all bipedal. The robust Australopithecines, the big ones, and they're not like big. I just mean like they're beefy. They're tough. They've got sagittal crests. They've got the cheekbones that allow for a strong bite, which you can see in Sasquatch morphology. If you look at Patty, you can see her pointy head. You can see her giant cheekbones. She doesn't have a big brain case. She's got a big head for chewing and ripping things apart, crushing, if you will. And so Paranthropus put all the meat, the tendons, the fur and or hair. They don't have fur. Put all the hair on them. They look like a Sasquatch. They're just 5 feet tall, not 7.5 feet tall. And that has to do with other laws of nature. Bergman's law, mammals farther away from the equator tend to be bigger as a way of retaining body heat. So looking at the fossil record, Australopithecines fit very, very well as a potential ancestor for Sasquatches, which would, if that's the case, that would put Sasquatches closer to us than chimps are. That doesn't mean they're human, though. There's a lot of people that say they're a type of human. If they evolved from Australopithecines, they did not evolve from Homo species, which is what we are. They're not humans. They're apes. Now, another theory that people have kind of put out there is that they're relic populations of Neanderthals. Well, probably not, because the last split between us and our common ancestor was Neanderthals. Like we occupied the planet at the same time. We evolved at the same time. We would have looked very similar. There's fossil evidence. We don't have fossil evidence of clothes. And right now there's no evidence that they didn't have a full body of hair, But there's no fossil evidence of clothes. But if you look at the wear pattern on their teeth, you can see the evidence of them tanning hides. The wear pattern of that shows they were tanning hides. So if they're tanning hides, they're probably using that to make clothing, to keep themselves warm in those cold environments they inhabit. So, and they were, flint knapping and making tools that we would recognize as humans today. They're making needles, they're making awls, they're making axes. Sasquatches don't do that. And why would you stop doing that? There's evidence of making fire. There's no evidence of any of these hominoid creatures making fire. There's no evidence of that at all. So that, like, I included the Neanderthal in that display because it's a theory that people have. I think it's the weakest one. I think that's just like maybe. I think there's more reasons why that wouldn't be an ancestor than there is reasons there would be an ancestry there. And plus, we could interbreed with them. There's a lot of people that have Neanderthal DNA in them still. So there you go. They're probably Australopithecines. We cannot make that decision for sure until we have a body and we find more fossil evidence. Right now, there's no fossil evidence of Australopithecines ever leaving Africa. But there is some theories as to the hobbit species, Homo floresiensis, that actually being an Australopithecine and not a Homo species. And if that ends up being the case, if that's what people end up deciding, then there you go. There's evidence that they left Africa, because those are over on the islands on the other side of Asia.
Yeah, I just had a guy on recently. It hasn't aired yet, but I interviewed Pete from Australia, and he's been down in the Solomon Islands. He got out of the military and went down there as a contractor, and he had some encounters with what he believes to be at least an offshoot, maybe not actual, but Homo floresiensis. These like 3 meter tall, ape like, hairy, bipedal creatures that the locals are seeing down there. And he ran into like 3 different times. And I know there were scientists that believe that they were around maybe up until the 1920s or so. So, in my opinion, in some of those isolated areas in those Solomon Islands, it may not be a far-fetched idea that they could be still some sort of surviving, at least small, isolated clan of these things, because that was one of the things that the stories were from the locals was, yeah, grandparents saw them, my parents saw them, and every generation has seen them a little bit less and less. So they're probably, if they're still around and those stories are true, they're probably aging adults that aren't procreating anymore and they're going to eventually die out. So it's interesting because, like you mentioned, there's always this disconnect of, at least in my mind as a skeptic, if I go there, how they made it over here. If there's not a ton of evidence that they ever left the area that we know they were in, how would they end up in North America and then survive all of these potentially millions of years to end up in somebody's backyard going through their trash trying to get their leftovers, right? So there's always that sort of stretch that puts you out there. So how do you deal with that as far as, I know it's, again, we're speculating, but how do you deal with that as far as how they would have gotten here and then have eluded us all this time?
Right. Well, yeah, again, like you said, it's all speculation, but it would be the same way that all the other animals got into North America, and vice versa, how all the other animals that evolved in North America got over into Asia. Like one of the little known facts, because you don't find them here anymore, is that camels originated in North America. They're not an Asian species. They're a North American species. Same thing with horses. Horses evolved in North America and had to be reintroduced after they went extinct, after the Ice Age. And so the horses you see today in the wild are not how they should look, but they act the same way. So filling that same niche. So they would have had to cross the land bridge. They would have had to cross the Bering Strait when the tide levels, the ocean levels fell during those interglacial periods of the Ice Age. Because the Ice Age is, it's a relative term. There was more than one Ice Age. It wasn't just one Ice Age with mammoths. There was a lot of them, and there was really hot periods too. So that would have been how they crossed over into Asia and then over into North America as well. And that one, that's the easiest explanation. There's other people that think that maybe they rafted across the Pacific Ocean, but I don't think that would have happened. The Pacific Ocean is so big. It's And if you have no control, where's all your food? It's going to take a long time to get over there. So it has to be the land bridge if that's the case. And yeah, there was a second part of that question. I already lost it. What was the other part? Like dealing with those people as say how do they get here?
Well, it was more about how they got here and then how they've eluded us for all this time.
That's what it was. Okay. Well, apes are very elusive creatures. It takes, when people are studying chimps, for example, usually it takes them a couple of weeks to locate the troop, even though they know the troop's already there. And they have all the tools and stuff to do it, and they still elude them. It's just apes are very, very elusive creatures. Now, tie that into the fact that Sasquatch is a very, very rare animal. There's not many of them out there, and they're not in big troops like chimps and gorillas are. If they're in family groups, which I think they are, there's probably 2 or 3 of them. And then there's the solitary ones. The males are it's probably like a semi-social thing where like a female and a baby will be together, and the male will come around every once in a while and show up and hang out for a bit, but then he takes off and goes somewhere else. And they just deal with each other. And that has to do more with resource partitioning rather than the fact that they just don't like being around anything. Because in North America, especially for apes kind of rely on fruit and stuff. And there's not a whole lot of wild fruit in North America, but there is a lot of prey. So that's why you get a lot of predatory animals and grazers. You get a lot of grass-eating animals rather than fruit-eating animals. But that's not to say there isn't fruit. You got wild berries and stuff, but that's not going to sustain you. So animals, they have to be more solitary. They have to spread out more. These animals that don't eat just grasses or other vegetation. And being that elusive and being very, very good at what you do, that's like it makes sense to me why people aren't catching them in cages, and they're big. They're very big. They can get out of whatever there has been the occasional Sasquatch that's been caught by a snare, but it's just going to pull the snare out of the ground,
Very
There you
true.
go.
I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about dinosaurs before we get out of here. So let's talk about anything new in the dinosaur world. I know that sounds kind of crazy to say because, we're talking 65, 70 million years ago, but is there anything new in the paleontology world surrounding dinosaurs? Anything new and exciting that has interested you over the last couple of years?
Oh yes. I mean, I'm always looking at new dinosaur facts. Like just like with Sasquatches, this is kind of a cool thing. Since we can't see a dinosaur, I mean we can. Birds are dinosaurs, but we can't go walk outside and see a T-Rex. We can't walk outside and see the long necks in the distance making noises at each other. But we can look at the very, very few fossil remains that are starting to come out. We're starting to identify that are not just bone. We're starting to get those dinosaur mummies that have some tissue preserved. We're starting to get feathers preserved, colors of these animals. We're starting to figure out what color dinosaurs were. One of my favorite ones, Archaeopteryx, the famous missing link between birds and dinosaurs. Since we have feathers, fossilized feathers of that, we're able to look at the tiny, tiny pigment fossils in there. Melanosomes is what they're called. And we're able to figure out that Archaeopteryx was probably black like a crow, flying around, probably acting like a crow too. Evolution is very lazy. It tends to reuse designs. Tylosaurus, a type of mosasaur, the marine reptile, not a dinosaur, but lived during the dinosaur age. It was colored like a killer whale, which makes sense in an ocean environment, the black on the top and the white on the bottom. So, but because it was a lizard, there's a TV show that came out on Apple a while back called Prehistoric Planet that fantastic. Love this show. And they're coming out with season 2 here soon, which I'm super excited about. Because it's like Planet Earth, but dinosaurs. I love it. They hypothesize that during the breeding season, the males change color, like lizards, which is a cool concept. Maybe, but we don't know for sure. The most recent paper that I've seen come out that is something that's just completely out of this world that I wasn't expecting was, I believe, somebody either reconstructed what it would look like or found fossil remains in some of the mummies of ankylosaur dinosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, vocal cords. And we're starting to come up with the idea that maybe they like, how did they sound? What did they sound like? And the idea was that they probably, like, these big giant tank dinosaurs probably chirped like birds, little whistling sounds, which is kind of, like, you see this giant intimidating thing and it goes tweet 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 tweet, and you're like, oh, all right, okay. But there you go, dinosaurs are birds, so it makes sense.
Yeah, very true. Very true. So let's talk a little bit about what you got going on. How can people find the Fossil Team? Do you have social media? Do you have a website? And obviously, we want to give a plug to the NABC, the North American Bigfoot Center. And am I mistaken? Are you writing a book or working on a book or thinking about working on a book? Let's talk a little bit about that process as well.
Yeah, I am working on a book right now. It's a theoretical book, which is, since we've been talking theory all night, I'm working on a book about it's like a tracking book. If Pleistocene mammals like mammoths and saber-toothed cats were still alive today, what would it look like? What would our world look like? What would our history books look like? And so my artist friend who's doing all the art for it, his name's Hodari Nundu. He is a fantastic artist and has been like, I had this idea and I came to him and I was like, hey, I love your art. You want to do this with me? And he was like, yes, let's do this. And I was like, oh my God, that's fantastic. And it just, the book is going to take much longer to make now because we keep coming up with cool ideas and don't know how to not do it. So yeah, to learn more about Fossil Team and keep an eye on that book, because we're probably going to self-publish it, honestly, after doing a bunch more research and stuff. But I don't know. We're still in the planning processes of this. You can follow Fossil Team on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. All of them I kind of do different things with. Like, Instagram is where you can follow where I do classes and updates of what we're doing in the field and stuff like that. Mainly the classes, though. Like, and actually what might be really good for your listeners to know is every month I do a hominid class. I do a class online all about hominology and Australopithecus and Gigantopithecus and all those things, because these podcasts have been asking me to come, and I'm like, I should probably give people a place to go. And I teach that class, so like you get to talk to me about it, and we get to nerd out about it, and you can ask me your Sasquatch questions too, I guess. So yeah, my classes are on my website, fossilteam.com, and yeah, Twitter, I just kind of more science, just like we talk. And sometimes I post classes, but I do Fossil Fridays there, and we talk about one of the many fossils that you can see behind me, and more. And yeah, I believe, just look up the Fossil Team and you'll find me.
I will link to that stuff in the show notes. And if you guys are out in Boring, Oregon, and you want to stop by the NABC and see Cliff and Nico and all the great folks out there at the museum, I highly recommend it. I definitely like to try to get out there maybe this summer at some point in time and see you guys and hang out and see what you got going on. Nico, I really appreciate your time, man. I've had a blast talking to you, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.